Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to this podcast. You are listening to The Shift. I am your host, Doug McKenty. If you like what you're hearing, please think about becoming a patron. That's at www.patreon.com/The Shift. If you want to find out more information, check out our Facebook page at The Shift with Doug McKenty. Join the conversation at Twitter at DMcKenty, or go to theshiftnow.com for any of my earlier work. This is The Shift, Episode 7. It's being recorded on August 4th, 2017. My guest today is Dr. Riane Eisler. She is the president and co-founder of the Center for Partnership Studies, as well as the author of the books The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, and the more recent The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics, in part a modern critique of Adam Smith's classical liberal text, The Wealth of Nations. Dr. Eisler is well known in the field of cultural anthropology for her revolutionary work comparing and contrasting domination versus partnership models of cultural integration. Her work at the Center for Partnership Studies seeks to implement the ideas behind a caring economy with real-world applications and raise awareness about how current dominator models serve only to increase human suffering for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. Dr. Eisler has been a huge influence on me personally, and I could not be more excited to have her on the program. Thank you for helping to make the shift. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Doug. And I'm so glad I've been a huge influence on you. Tell me about that.
Well, I studied philosophy when I was younger, and one of the first things that happened to me was as I got into studying Greek philosophy, I was just astounded. I think it broke me of the habit that we in the West so often have of thinking that everything improves over time, that we're on this kind of linear model. And I was studying ancient Greek philosophy, and I was thinking how smart these guys were. Well, I thought we were supposed to be smarter now, but I'm reading Socrates. I was getting a lot out of reading the Symposium at the time, and I remember kind of having a revelation about the farther back you go in history, maybe there are some ideas back here that we can learn from today. It's not just this linear progression that we're going through. And then actually the first book that I read was the Gamboutis book, The Myth of the Goddess, you're probably familiar with. They referenced the Chalice and the Blade probably 100 times in that book. And that was when I first found out about the dominator versus the partnership model. So then I read the Chalice and the Blade sometime after that, so I could get the full story from your point of view. But I just loved that concept that older cultures could actually contain knowledge that would be useful for us today, and in a kind of a natural intelligence, if you will, and that could shed light on different models or different concepts that we could really benefit from in this day and age. So I started going back older and older in my own thoughts about political philosophy, to try to gather, ideas about what we could do to make things better for us today. And I think that the Chalice and the Blade, of course, is such a pinnacle work in doing that. So, I think maybe we should start there. If you want to just start with how you developed that concept, what was the kind of work that you were doing, and when did that light bulb come on where you thought, hey, this is a partnership model, these older cultures that you were studying, and then learning to compare and contrast with the dominator model?
Good. I think that's a good place to start, because when I really started my cross-cultural historical work using a very, very large interdisciplinary database, trying to answer a question that actually arose in my childhood, which was a pretty traumatic one. I was a very young child when my parents and I had to flee Nazi Europe so as not to be killed. And so I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana, where I again was faced with injustice and trauma, really. The Nazis confiscated, that's an official term for armed robbery, everything my parents had. And basically, I saw these enormous disparities in that Cuba of that day under Batista, between those on top and those on bottom. And these questions kept coming up for me. Does it have to be this way?
Sure.
when we humans have such an enormous capacity for consciousness and for caring and for creativity, why has there been so much insensitivity, so much destructiveness, so much cruelty? And does it have to be that way? And if not, what are the alternatives? And it became very clear to me very early, and this is really fundamental, that using the conventional social categories of religious versus secular, or right versus left, or Eastern versus Western, or capitalist versus socialist, or any of, industrial or pre or post industrial. I mean, there have been terrible, terrible societies in every one of these categories. So I began to really leave those behind. And when I was no longer imprisoned in what a colleague of mine calls these old social categories, she calls them weapons of mass distraction.
Right.
Which I think is very apt, because if you really think about it, not only, as I said, have societies in all these categories been cruel and destructive and violent and unjust, but frankly, they're very incomplete, because they don't take into account what we've long known from psychology, and we today know from neuroscience, that how a society constructs our primary human relations, childhood relations, gender relations, the relations that children first experience and observe, affect everything, including how our brains develop. And so, if people grow up in what I called later domination environment, whether
Mm-hmm.
they're rightist, leftist, Eastern, Western, religious, secular, they internalize this idea that there are only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. And I took into account how the social construction of gender relations, which really I realized in my work, profoundly impacts not only our life choices as women and as men, but our system of values, whether the so-called, and I say so-called, feminine, the soft, the caring, the these sort of more empathic emotions have precedent, or these quote hard emotions, tempt and disgust, and the emotions appropriate for those who dominate, right?
Right.
Hold sway in all our institutions, from the family all the way to politics and economics. So I came up with these two alternative categories, or rather a continuum of, because it's never a complete partnership or domination system, a sort of a social scale. And I had always been fascinated. Sometimes I think my life is like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together, by prehistory, by these so-called mystery cults of antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in grammar school, my favorite class for some reason was prehistory. So I very much included in my database not only also the female as well as the male half of humanity, but also that long period we call prehistory, before deciphered records. And I began to understand that actually we've been presented a very false picture of our human possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we are raised in a culture that creates these dichotomies, like you were saying, and it is so profound. I mean, one of the things I try to do with this program is getting beyond the left-right paradigm, because when we talk about politics, so often it just gets mired down in these differences, and then nothing is actually getting done. I mean, we talk about that in politics all the time, but it actually separates us at a family level too. You're sitting around the dinner table with your family, and some people are Republicans and some people are Democrats, and they're just arguing, and it's automatically this it's like this dominator model, right? One person has to be right, one person has to be wrong. I love that idea of thinking of all things as a continuum. Like, what is going on here? Instead of creating the division, let's figure out really the common ground that we all have. I think everybody in the end is trying to figure out a better way. Like you're saying, you could see the devastation from what was going on in World War II and saying, well, we've got to be smart enough to figure out something better, um,
So I don't look at history as linear.
very good.
We are taught a linear, this notion that somehow we have progressed from barbarism, from that caveman cartoon, right? Who holds a club in one hand and drags a woman by
Right.
the other. And we show that to children before their brains are formed,
Sure.
which is really very unfair um, and and incorrect, because what we today know, and I'll just jump right into that and go back to the question you asked me originally about earlier societies. We know, for example, that we're told by we're told by original sin that there's something wrong with us, right?
Right.
We're told the same story from a secular perspective with this notion of selfish genes and this notion of our terrible primate heritage. Well,
Sure.
the fact of the matter is uh, that no, we did not kill each other on the savannah, and gathering hunting tribes to this day are more partnership oriented. They're more egalitarian, they have more gender equality, they're less violent. I mean, there's some violence, people lose it sometimes, but
Yeah, right.
they don't have organized warfare. And I also discovered from both the study of myth and archaeology that for a very long period, even into the age when some scholars today say, well, yeah, we were, less violent and mean and selfish and greedy before agriculture, even into agriculture.
hmm
The so-called Neolithic or early farming societies oriented more to the partnership than the domination side. And they were more peaceful. And you see a sharp break in prehistory with the shift to domination. They had much more gender equity. They venerated, the title of the book that I'm best known for is The Chalice and the Blade. And they're really two metaphors for power. The chalice is the power, it's a very important power. It's the power to give life, to nurture life, to really illuminate life. And they really were much more focused in their art on the power to give life, like in the so-called Venus figurines, these figures of full-bodied, full-breasted, often pregnant female figures, than they were on the power of the blade. That comes later. And if you really look at prehistoric art, you see a sharp break in it. And art is a kind of symbolic language, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So what caused the break, in your opinion? What do you think happened, and when did these dominator models start to present themselves? What were some of the major characteristics and the differences?
Well, about 5 to 6,000 years ago, you begin to see a shift, and there are many theories about it. One is that the advent of agriculture, of more settled communities, but as I said, there's archaeological evidence that that wasn't the case. So I subscribe more to the theory of climate change, aridification, that brought in, that made it impossible. I mean, you see a shift from gathering, hunting, from foraging, basically, to either farming or herding. And my theory is that in the more marginal areas, it was herding that took over, and herding depletes the environment without giving anything back. Um, so, I mean, farming can do that too, but not if you do it judiciously, um, which is another story. But anyway,
Sure.
but the point of it is there seem to have been hordes of invaders from these more arid areas into the more partnership oriented areas, either killing and destroying these cultures, And you see it break in the DNA. I mean, that's something we're beginning to learn today.
Interesting.
The concept without the frame of the partnership domination system, scholars don't know what to make of it.
Hmm. And so it's not quite just as simple. I mean, in my mind, I guess I thought, well, sometimes it was just the first cultures that created, entered into the Bronze Age and started making weapons, and then these weapons just technologically had this advantage, and it was easier to become. I guess the temptation then arose to follow the dominator model, where you can just steal stuff. You know, you don't have to grow it anymore. You don't have to gather it.
Well, the weapons start before the Bronze Age.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the work of Maria Gimbutas. She writes about the lethal power of the blade. She writes about how with the so-called Kurgan invasions, Kurgan because of the burials, so they were called by Indo-Europeanists, the Kurgan people. Before these people came in, you never saw in the art the veneration of the blade, of the weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And these people brought better weapons with them. There's no question about it. But the real issue, because technology, I mean, smelting, for example, was known to these more partnership oriented societies, but they didn't invest so much into weaponry as into art, into tools. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually kind of come to believe that's a fundamental difference in these dominator cultures where their technology is driven by war. If you look at our society is completely driven by the military-industrial complex. They kind of hoard the technology and then mete it out to the rest of us as they see fit, but they use it for war first. But in partnership societies, it seems like the technology was driven by art and create mythology and the cultivation of beauty
and tools. But it isn't so simple. I mean, East versus West is another very false dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at some of the Eastern societies, my God, they were constantly massacring each other, torturing each other. And as for a top-down control, I mean, just think of the Chinese emperors, think of the Indian rajas, think of the Arab sheiks. I mean, these were pure dominators. So I never think anymore in terms of East versus West. I think, or religious versus secular, because all the religious traditions have at the core partnership teachings of caring, of compassion, like the Golden Rule, right?
Sure.
But then they have this encrustment. It's like an old, beautiful old painting that's been painted over.
Right.
And they have all of these horrible rules. If a child strikes a parent, take him to the gates and stone him to death. If a woman is found not to be a virgin, take her to the city gates and stone her to death.
Right.
Pure and the control. See, one of the things, I mean, we can really jump now to contemporary times if you wish. If you have strongman rule in the family, it's not a big step to go to strongman rule in the tribe or state.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the first really lessons in human relations that children observe and internalize. And if they're based on fear of pain or observing that the bully, whether it's the father in the family or
Sure.
it's the sheik or the dictator, hey, it's a continuum in that sense too. And that's why it's so important to have these two models that take into account also not just where the conversation is today, politics, economics is conventionally defined, but
Mm-hmm.
that substratum on which it's like the domination pyramid rests on these foundations and keeps rebuilding itself on them, whether it's Muslim fundamentalism or American fundamentalism. It doesn't really matter. It's domination fundamentalism, isn't it?
Right. And you see the same characteristics, like you're saying, the list of rules that everybody has to follow and the hierarchy that's going on. And then even in the family, these kinds of where the father maybe is the power figure in the family, and you might see something like spanking or this kind of discipline that's enforced through some kind of violent behavior, really, some kind of with using fear. I mean, these characteristics are typical of the dominator model, I think, and you see it over and over again.
Well, this is why I have proposed, and I urge people to go to our website. I've proposed what I call an integrated progressive political agenda. And you can find it at at centerforpartnership.org if you go to politics. Because basically, if you analyze what's been happening in the United States over the last decades, the normative ideal, and this may not sound relevant, but it's totally relevant, the normative ideal for the family has been systematically and very deliberately pushed back. So that when I wrote an op-ed in 2007, where I pointed out polls that found that in 1992, when Americans were polled and asked, is the father the master of the family? I think it was something like, I can't remember the percentage, but it jumped over 12% by 2000. Why? Because of the Promise Keepers? Because you remember all of that stuff that was going on?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because of the normative ideal, the so-called family values, which really don't value families. They value a rigidly male-dominated,
Hmm.
really punitive, authoritarian family. And they pushed it deliberately back, and this was not an accident. So that when Trump got elected, people really were primed in a time of disequilibrium, of the shift from the industrial to the post-industrial economy where, automation, robotics are taking over so many jobs.
Sure.
They were primed to want, to want. And he presented himself, didn't he, as this strong man.
Right.
And
Well, it does seem like there's been a little bit of a pushback. I will say it's interesting to me because I'm not sure if I think that we've had a breakdown of the traditional family unit, and I think we are seeing um, maybe an attempt at holding on to that patriarchal system or that male dominated model. But going forward, it's actually, I mean, actually as a man, there's a lot of confusion. I have two kids. My wife and I are trying to figure out how to make it happen in this kind of new world. And it's very confusing. Sometimes my wife, wants to be the patriarch of the family, or she can be resentful of, and I don't want to say too much, but I think that it's easy for women to be resentful of the old model, but yet do we have a new model to replace it with? Where, well, as what you describe as partnership, how to be in partnership, even on that family level, is a very challenging prospect.
we're not taught it. I wrote a book called Tomorrow's Children on Education, and I suggested that caring for self, caring for others, and caring for nature, caring for life, should be part of the curriculum from preschool to graduate school. We're not taught relational partnership skills.
Right.
So, and if you look at the media, everything is about winning or losing, whether it's an election, whether it's a company, whether it's a American Idol, I mean, it sort of keeps drumming it into you that there is no partnership alternative. And by the way, I don't use the terms matriarchy and patriarchy because they're really semantically two sides of a domination coin.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, that's why I like the term partnership. And I think it's very important that I mean, I know that the norms are changing, but trust me, they're only changing for part of the population. Another part of the population, like, for example, all the men between the ages of 21 to 54, who rather than taking a job retraining for a caregiving profession, which is available, um, but they see it as below them, beneath them, because it's a women's thing.
Sure.
What do? They watch television, they drink beer, they play video games, and they drop out of the labor market. That's why we've got a huge number of males who have dropped out of the labor market, which is not even talked about. Why? I don't understand. Well, I do understand. It's much more convenient to say that we have low unemployment.
Right. Instead of being honest, I think that's probably another characteristic of the dominator model where they're constantly trying to um, pretend like everything's all right or everything is great because they've manufactured this incredible situation and instead of focusing on the problems and coming up with real world solutions about how to deal with it.
Well, we are shifting into an era from industrial. There was a huge change in people's work definition when we shifted from the agrarian to the industrial economy. Where only a very, very small percentage of people are doing farming today in an industrialized nation like ours. But what we're seeing now is the shift into the post-industrial economy. And in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, I take that into account. It's both a crisis, as the Chinese would say, but also an opportunity, because we have an opportunity to redefine what is and is not productive work. We have simply got to link that much talked about universal stipend for people, to giving something back, or we're going to get a lot of these guys who are drinking beer, watching television, and doing video games if you just hand them money.
Sure.
Solution, they have to give something back. And frankly, caring, creating, these are the things we need to reward. So in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, I've proposed what I call a caring economics. And I really urge readers to go to the website caringeconomy.org to find out about our webinars, find out about the book, look at the articles, because as Einstein said, we can't solve problems with the same level of consciousness that created them. Both capitalism and socialism came out of more rigid domination times, and frankly, they came out of early industrial times. And now, 1800s. We're now in the 21st century. Come on.
It is amazing that we still use, by and large, 150 to 200-year-old political philosophies to discuss our problems today. And then I think, I wanted to bring up that these dichotomies that are so easy in this dominator model to fall into, like as you're talking about, we're not taught these relational skills, which means, learning how to listen to each other and having respect for each other's feelings and, and ideas, and instead choosing a side, being on a team, and then trying to win the argument, if you will. And this has been going on for like these 200 years with capitalism versus socialism. And it's not, I think it's a great way to describe it. This is a part of this old dominator model. Why are we constantly fighting each other? I actually think even that it's a divide and conquer tactic that the upper classes are using against all the rest of us. Why are we down here arguing about capitalism versus socialism while they're taking off with billions of dollars,
and they're taking off with billions of dollars, whether it's in Russia, China, or the United States.
Sure.
It's in India or even North Korea, frankly. We're talking about domination regimes, and what they have in common is this top-down ranking, man over man, man over woman. That's a huge model for inequality, for equating difference, beginning with the most fundamental difference between female and male in our species, with either dominating or being dominated, with either superiority or inferiority, with either being served or serving. And I'm going to suggest to you, Doug, and I love the way you're upfront about the confusion about gender roles.
It's happening for sure, and it's difficult.
Yeah. No, and I suggest you take our webinar, The Power of Partnership. It's based on my book. It draws from my book called The Power of Partnership. which is about 7 relationships, starting with how we relate to ourselves, our intimate relations, our work relations, going all the way to how we relate to nature, um, and showing how it's all really very different, depending on the degree to which we are conscious of those dominator tapes that play in our heads.
It's such a bad habit to try to get over. The way you think about yourself or your relationships or joining that team. If you're, from the time that you were born, if your family chose a side or if you chose a side, and then, that conflict model is just so ingrained that it's very challenging to be able to get over it and understand how we really can work together if we are all working together and we're listening to each other.
Well, I think that for one thing, I think that we do need standards. And my standard is a human rights standard. And after that, of course, once you say that no, there are some differences I will not accept and will not go along with because they violate people's human rights, be it in the family, like genital mutilation of little girls or child marriages. I mean, these are anti human, or the way children are treated in so many parts of the world. I mean, I've done a lot of work. If you go to my website, which is rianeisler.com, a lot of writing in human rights, focusing again on the ignored majority, women and children. And that happens again in the family, which of course is the base, isn't it, of either a partnership or a domination way of living. But the point of it is we can change. I can attest to it. I've changed during my life. You've changed, haven't you?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
And
it's not easy, and,
right.
but let's give kids at least. That's why I focus so much on early childhood education being so important. I really urge our listeners and viewers, go to centerforpartnership.org, go to caringeconomy.org, and you'll see a whole new way of looking at economics, and frankly, a whole new way that is so essential right now of looking at politics, at looking at religion, at looking at our own family and other relations.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting, and I could bring this up now, I don't usually talk about this because I don't want this show to turn into a left-right paradigm kind of thing, but I typically lean towards more libertarian thinking, and I'm attracted to that classical liberal um, philosophical lineage. So it's interesting because I know that you're really focused on the social democracies, like in the Nordic countries, where the government has taken a role in the caring economy, where they're taking an active role in helping people out. And I just don't see that we need to be arguing too much. I mean, where I come from, what in the libertarian philosophy, you'll come across something called the non-aggression principle, which is that we don't, I think the concern from the libertarian point of view is that if the government gets involved in choosing the type of education that you're going to give us, instead of letting the parents choose or an individual choose for themselves what kind, or the kind of healthcare, the government chooses the kind of healthcare that they're going to give to the people. These are collective choices that the government is going to have to make one way or the other. What kind of healthcare do we give? What kind of childcare are we giving? What kind of education are we giving? As opposed to, I guess the libertarian model would hope that as long as everybody has enough money, the theory is that everybody would have enough money to make these choices for themselves. I choose this kind of education. I choose this kind of healthcare. Things don't have to be so expensive. But what I really got out of the New Wealth of Nations was this idea that I agree with 100%, which is that whatever is going on right now, they're spending a lot of money on other things and they're not, people aren't involved in, as you describe as the caring economy. Like, we just as a people need to shift from being willing to spend so much money on the military to just trying to care about the people. I mean, we've got, in this post-industrial economy, like you're saying, our productivity level is so high that if we just learned how to share everything, a little bit and not spend so much on the destructive machine, the war machine, then we've got abundance for everyone and we can figure out how to make a better life. Come on, people, right?
Well, Doug, it's so interesting because I don't think you're a libertarian. I mean, I know you identify as one,
Hmm.
but libertarianism is really about nobody telling you certain standards that somehow. But look, I mean, let's go to a faraway place, to what happened with the Ataturk in Turkey, which is now being reversed. If he hadn't come in, Turkey would never have changed some of those horrible, horrible practices that they had uh, in terms of violating human rights in families, children, women. Uh, I think that enlightened government does have a function. And as you say, that function has to go beyond uh, the old definition that of having a monopoly on violence, right? Which is
Right.
Ayn Rand's definition of the government. And I think that's insane because all it sets up are armed camps, right? Fighting each other.
Sure.
Um, and having said this, by the way, I think we do need a strong military because we're surrounded in the world as it is today by much more rigid domination regimes
Hmm.
than ours. I mean, as many faults as we have as a nation, would you rather live in Venezuela, Nicaragua, China, North Korea? I mean, think about it.
Sure.
Middle
Sure.
East, I mean, think about it. These are all dictatorships, and they're all places where human rights violations, especially in the family, especially against women and children, and I know that terrain, are just horrific. So I think that enlightened leadership is what I think about as a responsibility. On the other hand, while I do think we need a strong military, we're just completely insane. I mean, to add to a military budget that is already more than the next five countries behind us combined is a little bit crazy.
Right. That's excessive. Yeah.
I mean, and it isn't frankly doing us much good in an age of North Korea, in an age of terrorists who can. I mean, the big danger with North Korea is that they would give some nuclear weaponry to terrorists
Hmm.
against us. And that's a very real danger. And don't kid yourself, these people don't care. They have been so damaged by their own domination cultures that they're, we humans have an enormous amount of empathy that we're equipped with. I mean, I've been studying neuroscience a lot, which is another story. I also invite you to take my course called Changing Our Story, Changing Our Lives, because I think you will really enjoy that. Because one of the things I deal with is neuroscience and what
Okay.
they know about what it really means to be human. But my job in life, it seems, is to sort of really be outside of the prevailing paradigms, be it libertarian or be it. And by the way, the Nordic nations, the Scandinavian nations, they don't think of themselves as socialist democracies. They call themselves caring societies.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
Well, and I'm 100% behind you in terms of that. I think that we've got to get to this place where our feelings are connected to our decision making process. I mean, this being so attached to objectivity and logic and reason, I think if you take that too far, then you've detached from just caring about people. And by bringing it back to that, then, we can start to say, hey, why are we arguing about this stuff? Let's just, help each other out, make life a little bit easier.
I wish it were that simple that the problem is reason. I think the problem is that we are from childhood on, so many people are really sort of have this ingrained us versus them versus out-group thinking. And it's a scarcity mentality. I've written extensively in The Real Wealth of Nations about how domination systems, actually domination economics, create scarcity artificially. One way is what you mentioned, investing things in armaments instead of in developing our human potentials. But they also do it by misdistribution of resources. And by the way, studies show that not only do those on bottom feel insecure in what I call a domination economy, those on top do too.
Mm-hmm.
And because they think, oh my God, I'm going to get toppled. I mean, look at Trump. He's nervous as hell.
Sure.
It's pathetic,
Right.
the whole thing. But also because we don't invest in caring for children properly, and that means brain development. The whole system is designed to create artificial scarcity. Why? Because that maintains the domination system, doesn't it? There isn't enough, so
Sure.
I have to have more and more for myself. And of course, it also is designed to maintain overpopulation. And I have to talk about that because nobody wants to talk about it in the so-called liberal world.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't be having climate change if it weren't for overpopulation. I mean, it's the really combination of industrialism and overpopulation. And
Right.
that is, if you give women reproductive freedom, they're not going to have that many children. And yet, in the most overpopulated, poorest regions of our world, a man's honor, a man's status depends on his control over the many women and children in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And think about that. So we've got to change the system from the bottom, real bottom up. And that's what my work has been about.
Well, and this notion of creating scarcity too, if you think about the people who are on the top, I mean, the more they can create artificial scarcity, then the more they can charge for the things that they've made scarce. Like, I mean, we're looking at buying bottled water now. Water, which was something that we all used to just be able to get out of the stream or the creek, next to our house. Now we have to go spend $3 or $4 a bottle to get a bottle of the stuff at the store. So it's interesting, or even the control of the food supply that you see now. These big corporations, which I think also really affects overpopulation, and that they create so much cheap food. Instead of thinking about quality, they're thinking about quantity, and so we can feed all of these people. But why don't we have less people and feed them good organic food?
We're right back to the changing the family norms.
Mm-hmm.
Women having reproductive freedom, children being really nurtured and educated, and human rights, for goodness sakes. It's all very simple in some ways, but we've got to start talking about overpopulation because it's getting worse and worse. I mean, we're nearing 9 billion. I mean, this is insane.
Yeah, it is crazy. And there's no way that the planet's going to be able to sustain that for too much longer. Let's talk about then the caring economy in general, but even I know because you've kind of we're kind of dancing around it right now, but are these caregiver jobs and this caregiving notion, and these jobs that mostly women are doing these days, helping the elderly, taking care of the children, things like that. How do we make this shift into prioritizing those and even including them? I know at the Center for Partnership Studies, you're oftentimes things like this kind of work isn't even included in, say, statistical information like GDP, so it's just completely ignored.
Well, we've developed new metrics called social wealth economic indicators, which show the economic value of the work of care, which is still worldwide, really performed mostly by women, either for free in homes or for poverty wages in the market. So much so, and of course, this is disproportionately in the United States, has a terrible effect on women of color, who are very much the major workforce in this area with very little training, which is not good for anybody that they care for, or for themselves. And so many of them have to be on welfare to supplement to just eat. But yes, we have in our Caring Economy campaign, we point out that we, the United States, we show this in our social wealth economic indicators. And I ask people to please go to our website, caringeconomy.org. We are way behind every single developed nation in our investment in family support, our investment in early childhood education. We are the only one that does not have a national paid parental leave program. We don't. I mean, we have proposed caregiver tax credits because we have child tax credits, but the caregiver is still invisible. So in our family security agenda, and you can find that document at under politics in our website, centerforpartnership.org, we propose a whole array of progressive family policies. And this is very important. It's not only important in terms of the shift from the industrial to the post-industrial economy, in terms of the elder care crisis that we're facing, in terms of we have the highest child poverty rate. 1 of 5 children. That's insane.
Yeah. In the United States, it's crazy.
And we are so behind. We're first in all the wrong things: maternal mortality, child poverty. These are not the things we should be first in. Incarceration. Right. But I see. I'm a systems person, and I want to make this very clear. I don't think it really is useful to say these are terrible people up on top there. Because they are in a system that rewards certain kinds of behaviors.
Right.
In the Real Wealth of Nations, I make some concrete proposals for ways to change those rewards so that they're penalties rather than rewards for antisocial and anti-human, anti-earth behavior. We can do that. We can change the charters of corporations, for goodness sakes.
Sure.
So, we're talking about systems, and we're talking about economic systems that are not only economic thinking that is 200 years old and was dysfunctional then.
Right. It is interesting that, this term empathy, the caring economy, the idea about just, kind of operating from this heart level by just, caring about the people around you. In the partnership models, that seems to be the driving force. But then these dominator models, you really are seeing people that could very easily be characterized as sociopaths that rise to the top. If it's not outright aggressive behavior, it's almost could be characterized as passive aggressive behavior. I look at American foreign policy sometimes and I'm like, really? Can adults treat each other like this, where they're going around the world talking about American exceptionalism and just, doing whatever they want? And you're thinking that this isn't really the way adults should interact with each other.
I would suggest to you that the entire international relations community called the United Nations is a very dysfunctional one, because most of the members of the United Nations are dictatorships.
Right.
And so I really am always very careful to not say it's the United States that's the problem. Yes, there are policies that we have that are very anti-human and anti-earth. But we also have many privileges and rights in this country that the majority of people in our planet do not have. So rather than casting the first stone, so to speak, against us, because it's interesting, for the right, our country can do no wrong, and for the left, our country can do no right.
Right.
It's nuts. We've got to strengthen the partnership elements and understand what those are, and understand that it starts in our early relationships, at gender, childhood, the relations that whether it's a Khomeini in Iran or an ISIS or a Kim Il-sung in North Korea or a Stalin or a Hitler, they all paid enormous attention to support, getting women back into their quote traditional place in
Hmm.
quote traditional, rigidly male dominated, punitive, authoritarian family. Why? I mean, let's connect the dots, shall we?
Right.
There's a
W-
reason. There's a reason. And we have given over morality, family, values to the regressives, and we've got to reclaim them. And that's why I've really worked so hard on both the integrated progressive agenda and the family security agenda and the social wealth economic indicators as tools. Tools.
What do you think about public education, just in terms of how it could be restructured or formulated in order to teach these kinds of partnership methodologies at a younger age? Or,
I wrote a book about that called
right.
Girls' Children, and I recommend it to you. I think you'd love it. I think that the whole teaching to the test is an absolute disaster.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
first of all, it's antiquated because these are not the skills that people need, taking orders and being able to regurgitate the information. Uh, that was for maybe for a very regimented industrial era. But we're
Right.
not there anymore. And it was always anti-human and anti-human development. So of course we can change it. And that book, the subtitle is uh, really a blueprint for partnership education.
Hmm.
So it's there. It's gender balance. It honors diversity, but the positives about diversity, including the differences in characteristics that are considered masculine and feminine. Not everything that is considered masculine is bad. I mean, assertiveness is great, but women can also be assertive and should be.
Right.
Violence is bad, whether it's a woman or a man. So we shouldn't. Real masculinity is not being aggressive and violent. Real masculinity is being a good human being.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that these are, going back to what we were earlier talking about, is maybe one of the reasons too why you don't use those terms matriarchy and patriarchy. I mean, going again to that idea of continuum instead of creating these dichotomies and then choosing one over the other, because everything has positive and negative aspects to it. And just because you're a woman, you can't have maybe masculine characteristics, or if you're a man, you can have feminine characteristics. Everybody's different.
These are social constructs, cultural constructs. And yes, maybe in the course of evolution, because women give birth and can, feed babies, we were more inclined to learn caring behaviors. Men can also learn caring behaviors. Look at all the dads who are today diapering and feeding babies.
Hmm.
In a rigid domination system. Oh my God! I mean, sissy, wimp, and women
Right.
consider him that way. But there's a huge subculture, not only worldwide, but in the United States, that still hangs on to these dominator gender stereotypes. And it's a disaster. So it's up to us to show that there's a better way. And one of the strategies is giving value to the work of care. Because then care becomes more of a guiding principle in policy. Do you see what I'm saying? It's
Yeah, absolutely.
just the short term of poverty. I mean, women and children are disproportionately poor all over the world.
Hmm.
And a major reason is that this work is not rewarded, not valued. But it's more than that, because economics is really all about what do we value, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we got to change the value system.
So that's just one way of hatching two birds with one egg, so to speak.
Hmm.
I've tried to find metaphors rather than killing two birds with one stone.
Right.
Well, because we're so trapped, aren't we? in the old
Yeah.
dominator thinking.
Well, I can't tell you how frustrating it is for me, and that's definitely one of the reasons why I do this show is to try and figure out how we can get people just keep people from fighting each other really. Why are we always, there's two points of view, you've got to fight each other and then there's going to be one winner. It's like, wait a minute, we're all living in this world together. Let's figure out how to make it a more peaceful and enjoyable experience for everybody,
Yeah.
you know.
And that starts with basic standards of human rights and
Mhm.
responsibilities. But I also see conflict as an opportunity for creativity. I mean, once you meet those standards, because those are non negotiable. I mean, I think we can't just say, well, we'll work with ISIS, because ISIS is basically a pure domination model.
Sure. Do you see, though, a lot of times I think conflict arises out of trauma? I mean, when we have maybe it's the reason why the dominator model came out of the arid climates in the first place, because they just weren't given the abundance that other people in other geographical areas may have had. And so they turned it to this conflict model in order to try to make up for that feeling of separation or that loss in their lives. But it's the same on the family level. If you've been spanked all your life growing up, then you're going to grow up trying to spank your kid, right? And you're going to be
We also
frustrated, angry.
see violence as an appropriate way of solving problems and ending conflict, and that control rather than caring is the goal.
Right.
I mean, I empathize with your identification with libertarianism in the sense of wanting to have agency. At the same time, and I think we need it as humans, women and men, children, teens, we
Hmm.
for that. At the same time, I think that we have to create the circumstances, the social conditions that make us choose that agency in a way that recognizes that what's good for us also has to include what's good for others, because otherwise it isn't going to be good for us in the long term. This is not a question of self interest versus empathy for others. They're related. And that's what caring economy shows. That's what
Right.
partnership model shows. It's just facts.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. I don't think that we should be creating this dichotomy like you're talking about, where, libertarians or capitalists are self-interested and they're engaging in this competitive model. Um, I mean, that's true of people who are engaging in this corporatist model in this current system. But I view the dominator model as something else, almost like a criminal. Like I don't see. I know most people say progressives would see that the free market naturally evolves into this kind of dominator model, and I actually just find that dominators create the dominator model. I see it more as like a criminal enterprise that's just taken over, because just as you're explaining, um, it's all about human rights, really. And it's just the question is what are human rights? I mean, for a libertarian, the line is just typically drawn at, I have the right to self-defense and I have the right to property, let's say, and then,
Limited, so limited. You know what humans want more
mhm.
than anything else is caring connection.
Well, absolutely, and I understand that.
Part of the equation. I mean, I think that we're talking about a whole different way of thinking
Hmm.
here. And as I said, the first step, and it was the first step for me, was to free yourselves from the old categories. Look at an integrated model of society that doesn't just look at politics and economics, from the conventional but shows how they're rooted in what children observe and experience, gender relations, childhood relations, and how there's an interactive, not a linear cause and effect,
Hmm.
but an interactive for complex living systems. The old linear, this causes that, is totally inadequate. We know this
Yeah,
from chaos theory, from self organizing theory.
absolutely.
This is a whole different way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, very good. What do you think about the idea of decentralizing power? One of the things that I've worked on just in my own community is what it's called the community rights movement right now. There's just the idea that local communities should be more in charge of their own destiny so that we can make choices as a community rather than trying to extrapolate it out to the nation state or, or even to the United Nations. Um,
Well, I think that certainly there are environmental advantages to localized economics, but at the same time, you can have dominator local economics.
sure.
You can have dominator tribes, you can have dominator localities. So I don't think in those terms. I think much more in terms of what choices do people really perceive. And people who are raised again in rigid domination subcultures and families or cultures only see two choices: you either dominate or you're dominated.
Hmm.
And it is our job, every one of us, yours and mine, to show that there is a different way of exercising power, which is really what I call a hierarchy of actualization rather than a hierarchy of domination. And we need new words, actually, because a hierarchy of domination, we all know it's, you better listen to that guy on top or that woman on top, or else, there's going to be a lot of pain, even death, right?
Hmm.
Hierarchy of actualization is empowering rather than disempowering. And accountability, respect, benefits don't just flow from the bottom up, but they flow both ways so that you're accountable. So I don't see it so much of an issue as local versus national, but I see it as shifting from domination to partnership and to make choices. And I think this is probably a good place to end because we've been talking for quite a while.
Yeah.
Is basically, I want people to understand the partnership and domination continuum, to understand that these top down rankings are not just the conventional man over man, race over race, nation over nation, but it's also the ranking of man over woman. And that is also an authoritarian, rigidly male dominated, punitive family. We have to look at that as part of a system where there is freedom for those on top to do whatever they want, right?
Hmm.
Because that's how freedom is used now by so-called neoliberals.
Right.
Freedom from regulation. Well, what is regulation except saying, hey, you can't do that because it hurts somebody.
Sure.
Okay? So it's a whole different way of looking at the world. And I really invite you and our viewers to go to caringeconomy.org, to go to centerforpartnership.org. You can also go to my website, rioneisler.com, and to join our webinars because they're transformative and frankly, to read my books. And I've enjoyed talking with you very much, Doug. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Eisler, for being on the show. You've been listening to The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKenty. You can find out more about The Shift at our Facebook page. That's The Shift with Doug McKenty. Join the conversation on Twitter at DMcKenty and look at the archives and the other work that I've done at theshiftnow.com. If you like what you're hearing and you want to support the program, please check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/The Shift. And I will be back next week with another episode. So stay tuned for that. And thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
All right. We'll have a good one.